Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to set the scene immediately, really drag ourselves through the mud and the thick, suffocating jungle to the night of May 12th, 1945. We're in the remote hills of Burma.
And the atmosphere is just oppressive. I mean, you can feel it in the sources. The air is thick with humidity, the darkness is absolute, and the only sounds are the relentless rhythm of the monsoon starting up.
And something else.
Yeah, and the terrifying sounds of movement, something big closing in on a single isolated trench.
What's so crucial here is the tactical context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how quickly the stakes are just laid bare. This isn't some big, robust defensive line.
No, not at all. This is a forward listening post. It's barely even a trench, just a hole in the ground, maybe 100 yards ahead of the main perimeter.
100 yards.
And inside this muddy, completely exposed hole are 3 Gurkha riflemen. They're crouched low, listening to the very, very real possibility that they're about to be overrun by, well, an unknown but massive force of Imperial Japanese soldiers.
Sources put it at least 200 men.
At least.
Yeah.
200 men moving stealthily through the undergrowth, and they're all heading to one precise location, to that trench.
And the central figure in our deep dive today is Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung. He's only 27 years old, slight of build, standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, and he's gripping his heavy, reliable Lee Enfield rifle.
And you have to understand the immense strategic weight that is resting on this one tiny man.
Yes.
That forward post was the absolute key to the entire British defensive perimeter. It was the tripwire. If that trench fell, the Japanese wouldn't just breach the line. No, they would roll up the entire exposed flank.
That'd slaughter everyone.
They would slaughter 2 entire companies of surrounded Gurkhas who were relying on that forward position to buy them time. It was a simple, brutal, and frankly, terrifying equation for those 3 men.
Hold this tiny patch of ground or 200 of your comrades die violently behind you.
The tension in that darkness, I mean, just knowing that hundreds of enemies were seconds away, it must have been unbearable.
And the action doesn't sort of ease into the evening, it explodes.
Mm-hmm.
At 1:20 in the morning, that's when the first unmistakable sound arrives. It's not movement, it's the low whistle of a grenade arcing through the darkness.
Gurung sees it land just outside the lip of the trench, and he acts on pure instinct, pure training.
He scoops it up, throws it back, and the explosion does something the darkness had prevented. It lights up the jungle for a split second.
And in that flash, he sees the horror. Dozens of Japanese soldiers rushing the position, firing, screaming a massive banzai charge.
It's instantaneous, it's devastating. A second grenade immediately follows, lands inside the trench.
And again, driven by that same reflex, he grabs it, hurls it at the attackers, and it detonates in midair right over their heads. But the Japanese are just throwing them continuously now in waves.
The third grenade,
Mm-hmm.
it arcs through the dark, smoke-filled air,
Mm-hmm.
and it lands right at his feet, just nestled there in the mud.
He reaches down, he's trying to do the third miraculous throw, but he's milliseconds too late.
It detonates in his right hand.
The blast was catastrophic. I mean, that's the only word for it. Instantaneous and life-altering. The explosion didn't just injure him, it tore off the fingers of his right hand and just mangled his entire palm, a ruin of blood and bone.
Shrapnel rips into his face, destroys his right eye, blinding him on that side. Burns cover his right arm, his chest, his face. Fragments shred his legs.
And the sheer force of it throws his small body backward into the mud, bleeding heavily.
And here's the compounding tactical disaster. The same explosion that ruined Gurung also wounds the other 2 Gurkhas in the trench.
So all 3 men, the entire forward defense, are catastrophically wounded, bleeding out, and incapable of fighting. Within the first 60 seconds of contact, the key to the entire defensive perimeter is gone. It's compromised.
200 fanatical Japanese soldiers are charging straight at a trench that should have been silent.
Any rational soldier at this point would have succumbed to shock. They would have crawled back to the main line or just given up.
But that is fundamentally not the story we found in the source material, is it? We are here to deep dive into the truly impossible. How did Lachhiman Gurung, bleeding profusely, half-blind, missing most of his right hand, immediately proceed to grab his heavy Lee Enfield rifle with his left hand and hold that critical position alone for 4 continuous, brutal hours?
Resulting in 31 confirmed enemy kills.
Our mission today is to retell the continuous, cinematic, detailed narrative of this impossible one-man stand and really try to analyze the psychological engine that drove it. To understand that intensity, that depth of will that drove that single 4-hour action, we have to first understand the man and the deep history he carried with him into that trench. So let's look at the origins of Lachhiman Gurung.
Okay, he was born in December 1917 in a place called Dakani, which is a tiny remote village nestled high in the hills west of Kathmandu in Nepal.
And his background really is the defining constraint of his early life, right?
Absolutely. Life in the Nepalese mountains meant, well, extreme poverty. His father was a subsistence farmer, working a small plot of land that yielded barely enough food to sustain the family year to year. It was a life defined by physical hardship, relentless work, and a profound lack of opportunity.
Especially for young men coming of age in the 1930s.
In that isolated environment, the sources tell us there were really only two realistic paths for a young man like Gurung. You either continue the back-breaking subsistence farming cycle, or you join the British Indian Army as a Gurkha.
And these weren't just any soldiers. These were the legendary Gurkhas, mercenaries in the best sense of the word. They'd been serving the British Crown since, what, the early 1800s?
Since the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814-1816s. Yeah, a legacy stretching over 130 years by the time Gurung enlists.
And this legacy carried this immense, almost mystical weight.
Oh, for sure. The Gurkhas had established a fearsome reputation across 2 centuries of colonial wars and 2 world wars. They were known to be fearless, fiercely disciplined, and of course, instantly recognizable by the curved kukri knife.
A devastating, forward-curving blade that every Gurkha carried and was trained to use with lethal efficiency in close combat.
And critically, British commanders valued them above almost anyone else. They often referred to them as the finest infantry available. By World War II, the name Gurkha was synonymous with uncompromising ferocity.
I read that German troops had learned to dread facing them, and the Japanese in Burma, they definitely knew their reputation for never quitting.
And the philosophical bedrock of this entire warrior culture was simple, brutal, and just foundational. The motto was, better to die than be a coward.
And Gurung grew up steeped in this. He's hearing stories of local heroes who'd earned medals fighting for Britain in these remote conflicts in India, Afghanistan, the trenches of France in the First World War.
So for him, the army offered not just steady pay, which was a massive benefit to his family.
It was a way out.
It was genuine social respect and an escape from generational poverty.
But even with that legacy and that desire, there was a literal physical barrier. A big one.
A small one, actually. When Gurung decided to enlist in December 1940, the standard minimum height requirement for the Gurkha rifles was 5 feet tall.
He was.
4 feet 11 inches, an inch short. In peacetime, he would have been rejected immediately, no question.
But this isn't peacetime. And it's a critical detail that World War II intervenes right here.
It's everything. By 1940, Britain is fighting alone, suffering heavy losses in Europe, and desperately preparing for war across Asia. The need for infantry was overwhelming.
So they were waiving the rules.
The source material confirms it. Recruitment officers were quietly relaxing physical standards to meet the quotas. This desperate necessity led to Gurung's acceptance at age 23.
That 1 inch waved in the face of global war would ultimately save the lives of an entire company of his comrades. It's incredible.
And there's that fantastic, poignant anecdote that really brings his origins to life.
The cigarette story.
Yeah, the story, which was likely passed down through the regiment, says his father sent him to the village store to buy a simple item, cigarettes. On the way, he met a friend who was on his way to the recruitment station.
And Gurung just went with him.
He went with him, made his decision on the spot, signed the papers, and just disappeared into the army.
He never came home with the cigarettes. 5 years later, his father received not the cigarettes, but the formal report of his Victoria Cross action.
Wow. It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it? For the profound, life-altering choice he made that day.
So he was accepted, and he joins the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, a regiment with a deep and storied history where that code was literally carved into every soldier's consciousness.
And his training was relentless. It focused specifically on the demands of jungle warfare and uncompromising defense. He mastered the handling of a Lee Enfield rifle, its weight, its reliable bolt action, its accuracy.
But more importantly, he fully internalized the Gurkha code.
Yes, aggression in attack, but absolute stubbornness in defense. They were taught never to surrender and never to retreat unless a direct, formalized order was given.
So this idea of fighting to the last man, the last round, the last breath.
Yeah.
It wasn't just military rhetoric.
No, the source material confirms it was the core of his identity by the time he shipped out to Asia.
So by 1944, the 48th Gurkha Rifles are deployed deep into Burma, a theater renowned for its absolute brutality, and all that training immediately becomes applicable.
It does. I mean, when we discuss World War II, we often focus on the clear-cut lines of the European or Pacific theaters. But Burma was its own unique hell.
Yeah, that's essential context. It was defined by dense, claustrophobic jungle, unrelenting heat, and then the devastating monsoon rains.
Which turned the entire terrain into this thick, sucking mud. And diseases, malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, they often killed more soldiers on both sides than the actual combat did.
And beyond the physical environment, you had the Imperial Japanese Army, the IJA.
Right. They had ruthlessly conquered most of Southeast Asia, and their philosophical approach to war was defined by a fanatical commitment to the emperor and the nation.
Which meant that Japanese soldiers operated under orders to fight literally to the death. Surrender was viewed not just as failure, but as the deepest possible disgrace.
And they expected their opponents to fight with similar fanaticism. They rarely showed mercy to those they captured. So this creates a terrifying dynamic for the Gurkhas. Their enemy is one who would accept astronomical casualties just to achieve a small objective.
Or just to take as many opponents with him as possible.
Exactly. But by May 1945, the British and Indian forces were finally turning the tide. The campaign, Operation Extended Capital, was aimed at cutting Japanese supply lines and recapturing central Burma.
So the Japanese position is collapsing, but the remnants of their armies are still incredibly dangerous.
They're cornered. Scattered units are desperately trying to break out of encirclement, retreating south toward Rangoon. They're desperate, and they're willing to attack anything, anytime to survive.
And this desperation is what sets the scene for this place, Tongda. On May 9th, the 48th Gurkha Rifles are ordered to block these crucial Japanese withdrawal routes.
And the terrain, as you mentioned, is just awful. Dense, tangled jungle, trails churned into mud, and the monsoons had already begun, making visibility and movement extremely difficult.
So the Gurkhas dig in quickly. Gurung's company, C Company, they establish a perimeter.
They position themselves, very wisely, on a reverse slope, using the terrain to offer some cover from direct fire, with trenches and overlapping fields of fire. But the jungle is the great equalizer. Visibility was limited to only a few dozen yards, even during the day.
And at night, it was pitch black.
An environment that was perfect for the Japanese, who were renowned experts at silent, violent night infiltration and sudden overruns.
And this brings us to what the source material calls the suicidal assignment.
Gurung's section was assigned the most forward post 3 men in a small trench, roughly 100 yards ahead of the main British line.
Their job description was terrifyingly simple, wasn't it?
Provide early warning, break up the first wave, and slow the attack for as long as possible. The source confirms it was, without question, the most dangerous position in the entire defensive perimeter. The first point of contact.
And strategically positioned exactly where the Japanese would most likely strike.
They understood the risk. Gurung and his 2 comrades spent their final hours of daylight making these frantic preparations, deepening the trench, piling sandbags, clearing fields of fire, placing their ammunition boxes within easy reach. The training had prepared them.
But there's that one final telling detail that just speaks volumes about Gurung's mindset.
The kukri.
The kukri. He didn't just stage his rifle and his ammo, he placed his kukri knife on the parapet of the trench, within arm's reach.
And this wasn't a bayonet, which, requires a functional rifle. This was a dedicated, close combat weapon.
This detail confirms it. Gurung fully expected the Japanese to close the distance, and he was prepared to fight them with steel, one way or another.
So, the stage is now perfectly set for a full-scale assault. This is not a cautious probe. On the night of May 12th, the Japanese came, at least 200 soldiers strong, hitting C Company's position with a coordinated storm of fire.
Grenades, machine guns, rifles, and these screaming charges designed to shock and panic the defenders.
And their entire focus was on eliminating Gurung's trench, which they had correctly identified as the linchpin of the whole defense.
And we have crucial witness testimony that allows us to track this engagement moment by moment. A man named Naik Debasing Bura, Gurung's section commander, was watching this forward trench from only a few yards behind.
Though he was already pinned down himself by the immense volume of Japanese fire, at precisely 1:20 in the morning, the heavy grenade barrage began.
Bura saw the sequence unfold. The first grenade lands just outside. Gurung, despite the immense stress and darkness, reacts perfectly. Scoops it up, throws it back.
And that detonation is the flash of light that illuminates the horror. Dozens of Japanese soldiers rushing forward, already firing. Seconds later, the second grenade falls inside the trench.
Again, Gurung snatches it, hurls it out, and it detonates midair, showering the attackers with shrapnel.
But the Japanese are now screaming, firing, getting closer, driven by this fanatical zeal.
Then comes the third grenade, arcing slowly through the darkness, landing right at Gurung's feet.
He bends down. The sources emphasize he was attempting to repeat the maneuver that had already saved them twice, but this time, the fuse was just too short.
It detonates before he can throw clear. The blast was, to quote the official citation, catastrophic.
We need to dedicate a moment to just visualizing the instantaneous physical cost of this. The high explosive detonated in his right hand.
The force and shrapnel tore off all the fingers of his right hand and completely mangled his palm. A devastating injury. Instant, massive blood loss.
And at the same time, shrapnel fragments rip into his face, destroying his right eye, blinding him on that side. He suffers severe flash burns across his right arm, chest, and face, and fragments hit his legs.
He's thrown violently backward, suffering from massive shock and hemorrhaging profusely.
And the blast wave just compounds the crisis. It wounds his other two comrades in the trench, rendering all three defenders down, bleeding, and functionally unable to fight.
Within 60 seconds, the entire forward line is silent. And 200 determined Japanese soldiers are seconds away from overwhelming the position.
This is the absolute turning point, the point of no return. The tactical necessity of holding the trench just collided violently with the physiological reality of the human body.
Any other soldier would have either retreated, sought medical aid, or just collapsed from shock. Survival instinct demands self-preservation.
But the source material is explicit, and it's confirmed by the citation. Lachhiman Gurung did not retreat. He didn't even pause to assess his wounds.
So now we enter the phase that it defies medical and tactical analysis. Part 4, the 4-hour stand. He is now functionally a one-handed, half-blind man, bleeding out from dozens of wounds.
Yet he grabbed his Lee-Enfield rifle, not with the ruined right hand, but with his good left hand.
Let's focus intensely on the improvised battle plan here and the incredible technical difficulty of what he did next.
Okay, so he's armed with the Lee-Enfield No. 4 rifle. This is a heavy bolt-action weapon, weighs about 9 pounds when loaded, and crucially, it is designed entirely for right-handed operation.
Right. A right-handed soldier fires, then swiftly moves their right hand up and back to cycle the bolt, extracting the spent cartridge, loading a new round, while the left hand supports the rifle.
And Gurung's right hand was a stump. It was useless. To operate that bolt, which is often stiff, especially when it's covered in jungle mud and grime, that requires significant physical leverage.
He had to improvise completely.
He braced the butt of the rifle against his left hip or shoulder. He grasped the complex bolt handle with his left hand, forcing it upward, pulling it back to cycle the action, pushing it forward, and finally locking it down.
And this entire sequence had to be done under fire, accurately and rapidly enough to keep the charging Japanese at bay.
It's truly incomprehensible. That motion requires fine motor skills, strength, massive leverage, all elements he had just lost. He was learning how to master the weapon's core function one-handed, in pitch darkness, while suffering catastrophic trauma.
And yet, he started firing.
The Japanese expected to find dead defenders. They expected to simply walk over the sandbags. But what they found instead was shocking and confusing.
A Gurkha rifleman who was not only alive, but was shooting back accurately, rapidly, and killing the lead attackers. And he was screaming defiance in Gurkhali, challenging them to try and take the trench.
That initial shock, it bought him precious seconds. The Japanese advance stopped cold. They couldn't understand why this position, which should have been silenced by their massive grenade barrage, was still spitting controlled, accurate death.
And Gurung capitalized on this confusion, killing several more soldiers and causing a dangerous disorder in the enemy ranks.
So the Japanese quickly adjusted. They resorted to continuous grenade attacks into and around his position, but he could no longer rely on that two-handed maneuver to throw them back.
So the source material states that he pressed himself against a trench wall, shielded himself as best he could, and just let the subsequent explosions wash over him.
He took more shrapnel, more burns, and kept firing. The bodies of the attackers piled up quickly, eventually forming this grim barricade that slowed the surviving Japanese.
Make Bura, watching from behind, relayed that the sound of Gurung's rifle was different. It wasn't the scattered fire of a squad, but a continuous, deliberate series of precise shots.
Burma described it as something beyond normal courage, a wounded man fighting with the sustained effectiveness of a full-strength squad.
And reinforcement attempts were impossible. The fire between Gurung's trench and the main line was too intense. He was utterly, completely alone.
Let's delve deeper into the physiological horror for a second. He had suffered an immediate, massive loss of blood and catastrophic tissue damage.
In normal circumstances, the body's response to that kind of trauma is hemorrhagic shock, which leads to confusion, rapid loss of blood pressure, and unconsciousness.
The fact that Gurung stayed conscious, let alone capable of complex motor skills like aiming and cycling a heavy bolt, it defies standard medical understanding.
He was running on pure adrenaline, yes, but far more profoundly, he was running on an absolute, ingrained sense of duty.
His sole purpose: hold the trench, stop the Japanese, protect his brothers in arms. It overrode his body's panic responses. The pain from the ruined hand must have been paralyzing, but Gurung just internalized it. His job was singular. His survival was secondary.
The Japanese officers were baffled and infuriated. They outnumbered him 50-1, attacking the designated weakest point, yet one wounded Gurkha was stopping their entire coordinated assault.
So officers desperately tried to rally charges, which continuously met the same result: accurate rifle fire, dead soldiers, and that single voice screaming defiance from the forward position.
His tactical resilience was phenomenal, especially considering his limited vision. When the Japanese tried flanking the trench through the dense jungle, he shifted his fire, covering those approaches.
And the claustrophobic terrain actually limited their mobility, forcing them through this narrow front right into Gurung's killing zone. The battlefield was black, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and the occasional grenade.
So he was firing at flashes, sounds, and shadows, hitting targets he could barely see, proving far more accurate and controlled than his full-strength, desperate opponents.
Bua's later testimony just captured it perfectly. He said Gurung fought like a demon, like something beyond human.
His ability to aim effectively with only one functional eye and to operate the rifle one-handed, particularly under the stress of reloading, was what ultimately broke the Japanese attack.
They couldn't pinpoint exactly where the fire was coming from because he was constantly shifting fire and position within his small trench. He was presenting a difficult, relentless target.
Now we reach this critical phase of ammunition calculation. Gurung started with a basic combat load, likely 50 rounds in his pouches, plus the 10 in his rifle.
Over 4 hours, he fired continuously, but every single shot had to count. He couldn't waste rounds, but he couldn't let them close the distance either. He had to sustain suppressive fire while meticulously conserving enough ammunition to survive until dawn.
And the reloading process itself was a profound vulnerability. Normally, reloading the Lee Enfield is a fast, two-handed maneuver. For Gurung, using only his left hand, it became a slow, agonizing process.
He had to drop the rifle briefly to fumble for the rounds, load them by feel in the darkness, and get the rifle back into action, all while the Japanese were charging and firing.
It was a vulnerable moment he repeated hundreds of times over 4 hours.
The sources note he sped up the process through sheer necessity, relying on touch and muscle memory ingrained during his training.
So the clock ticks past 2:00 a.m., 2:30 a.m., and around 3:00 a.m., the intensity just ramps up dramatically.
Yeah, this wasn't a random rush. Intelligence suggested this was a coordinated push. Japanese officers, realizing this single post was destroying their entire breakout plan, rallied their remaining men for one final, determined attempt.
Coming from multiple angles, accepting devastating casualties, just determined to overrun this lone man.
Yeah. And Gurung met this coordinated assault with the same terrifying response: controlled, accurate, relentless rifle fire. At this point, he must have been operating on pure instinct.
His training was so deeply ingrained that his left hand was executing the bolt cycle without conscious thought, overriding the pain and the immense blood loss. Aim, fire, cycle bolt, aim, fire.
That continuous cycle of his rifle fire was the sound that saved C Company. Japanese soldiers fell, and yet again, the assault broke against his trench like a desperate wave against a granite cliff.
By 4 a.m., the attacks began to lose momentum. The sheer accumulation of casualties, the number of bodies in front of that trench.
And the overwhelming, almost superstitious fear of the unseen defender who simply refused to die. It became overwhelming for the attackers. The Japanese forces began to pull back, trying to regroup.
They couldn't bring their massive numerical advantage to bear.
No, advancing meant running straight through Gurung's killing zone, and no one wanted to be the next soldier to fall.
Gurung, used that final crucial lull to take stock. He was barely conscious, severely weakened by massive blood loss and shock. He checked his ammunition.
Not many rounds left. Maybe enough for one more attack.
He didn't think about evacuation or his wounds. He just watched the darkness, kept his rifle ready, and waited for the inevitable next assault.
And behind him, the rest of C Company was holding its breath, listening to the unique, controlled rhythm of that single rifle.
Naik Bura had reported the situation to the company commander. One rifleman, heavily wounded, holding the forward post alone. The commander was skeptical. He initially disbelieved the report.
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Of course. But then he listened to the pattern of fire. Single rifle shots, controlled, precise, still coming from that forward position at intervals, long after it should have been overrun.
They realized he was still holding, still fighting the entire force alone, but they couldn't reach him. The ground between his trench and the main line was controlled by Japanese machine guns.
Any relief attempt would have been instantly wiped out. So Gurung stayed alone, outnumbered, wounded, running out of ammunition, but refusing to yield.
And as dawn began to approach, between 5:00 and 5:30 a.m., the Japanese tried one final, desperate charge. This was their last chance before daylight exposed them to Allied aircraft and artillery observers.
They charged, screaming, believing that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm the single defender.
Lachhiman Gurung met them with his last rounds of ammunition. He fired until the rifle magazine was completely empty, and then, when the rifle fell silent,
he grabbed his kukri knife from the parapet. He was ready.
If the Japanese reached his trench, he was prepared to fight them with cold steel, one-handed, half-blind, bleeding out. He would adhere absolutely to the maxim, better to die than be a coward.
But the attack had broken the Japanese will.
Yeah.
That final charge, it faltered. It broke before it even reached his trench.
Attackers fell, and the surviving remnants just pulled back into the jungle. They withdrew, defeated by one man, leaving their dead behind, retreating from a position they should have overrun in minutes.
As the sun rose on May 13th, Bura and the other Gurkhas rushed forward. They were expecting to find only a corpse.
Instead, they found Lachhiman Gurung alive. He was barely sitting in his trench, surrounded by empty rifle casings, his Lee Enfield resting in his lap, his kukri knife ready on the parapet.
His right hand was a ruin, his right eye gone, blood everywhere. But he was conscious. He was still watching the jungle, ready to fight if they came back.
They immediately pulled him out, gave him water, and quickly evacuated him. The damage was, as we noted, catastrophic. Field surgeons worked tirelessly, they saved his life, but they couldn't save his limbs.
His right hand was amputated, leaving only a stump, and his right eye was permanently blind.
He had survived the physical trauma and massive blood loss only through his immense internal will.
And here's the confirmed final evidence that solidified the impossibility of the stand. While he was being evacuated, the other Gurkhas examined the battlefield.
And the confirmed narrative. 31 dead Japanese soldiers lay within a few yards of his position.
31. 31 confirmed kills, all shot by one man, with one functional hand, across 4 hours of continuous, desperate combat.
The physical evidence, the bodies, the grenade remnants, the blood trails, the concentration of fire, it told a story of a one-man defense that had stopped an entire major breakout assault. The recommendation for the Victoria Cross was immediate.
It was based on Burr's detailed report, describing an action that just defined heroism, holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds, fighting despite catastrophic wounds, and saving his entire company through sheer willpower and skill.
The Victoria Cross citation was approved and published in the London Gazette on August 9, 1945, just days before the end of the war.
And the language in the citation itself is just so powerful. It details how he twice hurled back grenades before the third exploded in his right hand, blowing off his fingers and severely wounding him.
And it concluded that he, and this is a direct quote from the source, now alone and disregarding his wounds, loaded and fired his rifle with his left hand for 4 hours, calmly waiting for each attack, which he met with fire at point-blank range.
Confirming the 31 dead Japanese soldiers around his position.
It remains the highest decoration for valor in the British system, and the source notes that only 13 Gurkhas have ever received it. Gurung's action wasn't just a combat feat, it was a physical and psychological definition of duty under unimaginable duress.
Gurung recovered in military hospitals as the war ended, and he eventually returned to Nepal to his tiny village, famous across 2 continents, carrying the Victoria Cross but missing an eye and a hand.
And life after the war was, perhaps surprisingly, defined by difficulty. He couldn't farm effectively with one hand, and despite his Victoria Cross, the British government initially provided only a small pension.
So he struggled financially for many years.
He did. He married, had children, and became a living legend in Nepal. The one-handed Gurkha who had stopped 31 Japanese soldiers' children grew up learning his story in school as the ultimate example of national courage.
His sacrifice, however, was not forgotten by the public or his regiment. In 1995, 50 years after the action at Tongda, he was invited to London for these high-profile commemorations.
He was personally honored by Queen Elizabeth II and met with other surviving VC recipients. And when people asked him how he achieved the impossible, Gurung's answers were always simple, devoid of bravado.
I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. I did what needed doing.
Yeah. He eventually received better support in his later years, thanks in part to public advocacy and increasing awareness of Gurkha veterans' struggles, which led to the British government increasing pensions significantly.
And he used his status as a living legend and VC holder to become a powerful and crucial advocate for Gurkha welfare, reminding everyone that soldiers from Nepal had served Britain faithfully for generations and deserved comprehensive respect and support in their old age.
Lachhiman Gurung died peacefully on December 12, 2010, at the remarkable age of 92. Having lived a full life despite his devastating injuries, his passing was mourned across both Nepal and Britain.
And the story of his stand was repeated in obituaries and remembrances, cementing how courage and duty had overcome injury and impossible odds.
His legacy endures not just as a historical event, but as a teaching tool. The 8th Gurkha Rifles specifically teach his story to every new recruit, ensuring that new generations internalize the exact practical meaning of the regimental motto.
But the most important legacy is the impossibility of the action itself, which we have to analyze one last time. He was not superhuman, he was 4'11", poor, and without any special advantages.
And the Japanese were fanatical, well-equipped, and held every single tactical advantage except for his profound refusal to yield.
There's a temptation, particularly in military analysis, to dismiss actions like Gurung's as a random statistical aberration, an impossible outlier that normal soldiers couldn't replicate.
But Gurung himself rejected that label. He considered himself an ordinary Gurkha doing his duty. He didn't calculate odds, he certainly didn't consider alternatives. He had one job, hold the trench, and he held it until the enemy broke against him.
And let's bring in one final fascinating tactical nuance. His 4'11" height, which was almost a professional barrier to him even enlisting. Ironically, it may have provided a crucial tactical advantage in that small, improvised trench.
How so?
Well, shorter men require less depth for complete cover. When that grenade barrage was washing over the parapet, his small stature likely allowed him to press lower and deeper into the mud, maximizing the protection offered by the trench wall and minimizing the secondary damage from explosions.
Wow, so the one physical attribute that almost kept him out of the fight might have helped him survive it? That's an ultimate detail of fate.
The ultimate lesson from Lachhiman Gurung is perfectly clear. Courage is fighting despite paralyzing fear. Duty is performing your job when every physical and tactical metric says it's impossible. Honor is simply refusing to accept defeat.
And the story remains, passed down through military academies, serving as a reminder that the mantra, "better to die than be a coward," was a reality proven by one small man on May 13, 1945.
So the Japanese couldn't overcome Lachhiman Gurung, not because of superior weaponry or tactics, but because of a depth of duty that just defied shock, injury, and logic.
And, military analysts will forever study the psychology of his feat, trying to find some quantifiable variable, some unique neurochemical advantage. But if the truth is simply that he was highly trained, incredibly brave, and accepted no alternative to success because of an absolute, unbreakable sense of duty, what does that ultimately tell us about the psychological and physical limits we, in safer times, place on ourselves?
That refusal to fail, that absolute commitment to duty above self-preservation, is the ultimate nugget of knowledge from this incredible deep dive. When you face a task that seems impossible, when the odds are stacked 50-1 against you, remember the image of a man, half blind and missing a hand, cycling a heavy bolt-action rifle alone in the darkness. He held the line against 200 soldiers for 4 hours, simply because, as a matter of duty, he refused to quit.